Hey everybody, Billy Obenauer here, continuing our series on knowing a company's fundamentals of human resource management. In this video, we'll be covering Chapter 12, Establishing a Pay Structure. Now, when we talk about a pay structure, we're actually talking about two separate things here within our organizations. All right, and the first component that we're talking about is the job structure. And this is the relative pay for different jobs within the organization. In other words, how do we pay one job compared to another? Okay, so our outside salespeople paid more than inside salespeople. Our managers paid more than salespeople in general, and so on. And then the other component is the pay level, which is the average amount that the organization pays for a particular job. All right, so maybe we pay $60,000 a year for a certain job. Maybe we pay $40,000 a year. Those would be examples of the pay level. Now together, they combine to form the pay structure, which is the policy resulting from these two components. This graph helps us conceptualize what a pay structure actually looks like within an organization. Okay, so as you see here, we can compare position A to position B, we can compare that to position C, and we can compare that to position D. And that's the example of the job structure. And then over here on the left-hand side, we have the actual pay. And we can look at each one of these components and see what we pay for position A, what we pay for position B, what we pay for position C, and what we pay for position D. And that's showing us the pay level for each position. So as we look at this combination of pay level and job structure, that's what an actual pay structure looks like within an organization. As we move through this lesson, we're going to take a look at how a variety of different factors influence the development of our pay structure. We're going to start by looking at legal requirements such as equal employment opportunity, minimum wage, overtime pay, and child labor. Then we're going to take a look at market forces such as product and labor markets. Then we'll talk about our organization's goals, and together we're going to look at how these different factors influence the pay level, the job structure, and the pay structure through their impact on pay rates, pay grades, pay ranges, and pay differentials. Equal employment opportunity laws are going to play an important role in your organization's pay structure. Okay, and as we discussed when we discussed the Civil Rights Act, differences in pay can't be based on an employee's age, sex, race, or other protected statuses. Now, often when such differences in pay do exist, organizations are counting on employees not sharing pay information with each other. In many cases, employees think that they're not allowed to share their pay information, but the National Labor Relations Act allows for concerted activities for the purpose of collective bargaining or other mutual aid or protection. And many legal scholars have actually interpreted that as saying that employees are legally allowed to share their compensation information with each other so that they can aid and protect each other. All right. Now, the Equal Pay Act of 1963 says that men and women must be paid equal pay for equal work. Okay, but the laws don't actually guarantee equal pay, as there are legitimate factors that organizations can consider that may influence a person's earnings. So for example, organizations can consider experience, skills, seniority, and job performance. And these differences actually allow for the perpetuation of the gender pay gap. As a result of this, some legislators have argued that we need to institute comparable worth policies. And with a comparable worth policy, what would happen is we would perform evaluations of different positions, assign them points, and these points would determine the pay for a position. So pay for a job would basically be based upon the needs and the importance of the position as opposed to the perceived value of the employee. Now finally, the Lilly-Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009 changed what the statute of limitations looked like for pay discrimination cases. So Lilly-Ledbetter had sued her employer, Goodyear Tire, because she had been paid less than any other men in her position for almost 20 years. And at first she won her case, and then it was overturned. And the reason that it was overturned was that the statute of limitations had passed. Okay, but The problem with this is that the statute of limitations at that time was based upon when the first instance of discrimination took place. And what the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009 did was it made each paycheck a new action or potential violation of the law, so that each time an employee was paid, the clock for the statute of limitations was reset. What this means for you as a manager is that if your predecessor has discriminatory compensation policies in place and you inherit these policies, you're still responsible for them, because each time you pay your employees an inequitable wage, as far as the law is concerned, you've just committed a new act of discrimination. The Fair Labor Standards Act establishes regulations as they pertain to minimum wage, overtime requirements, and child labor. Now, what you need to know about minimum wage is that minimum wage represents the lowest amount that employers can pay their employees. Okay, minimum wage can be regulated by the federal government, by states, and even by local municipalities. Okay, it's typically stated as an amount of pay per hour. And what employers need to do is they need to pay the highest minimum wage that is required within their geographic jurisdiction. And what I mean by that is that the federal minimum wage in 2022, while I'm recording this video, is $7.25. At this same time, Maine is in the process of raising the state's minimum wage to $12.75. That means that employers in the state of Maine will have to pay their employees at least $12.75 per hour, regardless of what the federal minimum wage is. Now, if the federal minimum wage was to exceed $12.75, let's say the federal minimum wage went to $14 an hour, then employers in the state of Maine would have to pay $14. Okay? In some areas, there are even city minimum wages. Cities like New York City and Seattle have established minimum wages for employees. And in those cities, the city minimum wage tends to be higher than the state or federal minimum wage, and businesses must comply with what the city has regulated. Okay, we also see states regulate minimum wage for tipped employees. So for example, in Maine, the base minimum wage for tipped employees is $6.38 per hour. But employers must also be able to show that employees are making enough in tips that they are reaching that minimum wage of $12.75 per hour. Overtime, as regulated by the FLSA, refers to any hours worked beyond 40 hours in a week. And this is regardless of whether or not the hours are scheduled or not. So if you're scheduled to work 48 hours a week and you work 48 hours, 8 hours of that time is overtime. And under the FLSA, employers have to pay 1.5 times an employee's usual rate for overtime hours. So if you get paid $20 per hour and you work 50 hours in a week, 10 of those hours are going to be paid at $30 an hour. Okay, now not all employees are eligible for overtime. So exempt employees, who can be managers, outside salespeople, and some other administrative positions, are not covered under the overtime clause in the FLSA. Okay, now how somebody is determined to be exempt is based upon their job duties and their salary. Now this doesn't mean that employers can't give bonuses or extra pay to exempt employees. They can if that's what they need to do to be competitive, but the law doesn't require it. Okay, all non-exempt employees, typically your hourly employees, are covered by the FLSA and are required to receive overtime pay for time beyond 40 hours. Now, one thing that you want to remember as an employer is very tempting to try to cut overtime hours. And what I mean by this is that if an employee has a lot of hours in a week, you may want to send them home early so they don't get their overtime. But you need to think about how this is going to impact your business. So if I ask somebody to work late on a Monday, maybe they miss an important family event. And now all of a sudden Tuesday I want to send them home early so I don't have to pay them overtime. The next time I ask them to work late, they might not want to do it. So we want to be careful about how we manage overtime within our organizations. Now the FLSA guides us with restrictions on child labor that get a little more permissive as children get older and older. Okay, so children under the age of 14 can't be employed with a few exceptions. All right, and those exceptions include babysitting, acting, and delivering newspapers. All right, then once a child becomes 14, they're able to work in a lot more jobs, but it needs to be outside of school hours, it has to be in non-hazardous positions, and they have to be very limited time periods. Okay, then once a child reaches age 16, they can work with fewer restrictions, though they still can't work in hazardous jobs. And this may sound kind of basic and common sense here, but I actually dealt with this at one point in time in my career where I went in to work in a lumber yard as a manager. I was the assistant manager, but a salaried manager, and we had multiple teenagers operating forklifts when I got there. And that was something that I had to deal with. I had to work with my boss who didn't seem to realize that he was breaking the law to make some scheduling changes and readjust how we were doing things so that we were in compliance with FLSA. There are also regulations that require federal contractors to pay prevailing wages to their employees. For example, the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931 requires that construction contractors receiving more than $2,000 in federal funds pay prevailing wages, and the Walsh-Healy Public Contracts Act of 1936 requires that all government contractors receiving over $10,000 in federal funds pay prevailing wages. And what this does is it prevents the federal government from benefiting from contractors who underpay their employees. Beginning in 2020 with the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, publicly traded companies became required to report the ratio of CEO pay to pay of the median employee. And this was intended to increase transparency around pay policies within organizations. And if this ratio is large, it indicates that CEOs make considerably more money than other employees within the organization. We got to be careful how we interpret these numbers, however. Sometimes if we have a large ratio here, people assume that that means the CEO is highly paid, and that very well can be the case, but it also could mean that we're looking at an organization within an industry where employees are not paid very highly. And we know that compensation can vary by industry. So we just want to make sure we understand the context of where we're considering this ratio before we draw any meaningful conclusions. Now we're going to move on and discuss some of the market forces that influence our pay policies. And the first market force is our product market. And these are the organizations that offer similar goods and services to us. Okay, so if you were, say, an HR manager within a school district and you were hiring bus drivers and you were figuring out your pay policy for bus drivers, your product market would be other school districts that had busing and were hiring school bus drivers. Okay, then our labor market are the other organizations that we're competing with for our human resources. Okay, so they may be in completely different areas. So if we're hiring bus drivers, our labor market might include Uber because people could go drive for Uber instead. It might include trucking companies because maybe they could go drive for a trucking company. It includes basically any other place that the candidate pool that we're going to be recruiting from or hiring from is going to potentially work outside of our product market. And this chart here kind of breaks down the product markets and labor markets a little more. So if we were at a university and we were hiring faculty, let's say we needed to hire clinical nursing faculty, well, we'd have to consider what other universities are paying for clinical nursing faculty, but we'd also have to think about what hospitals are paying registered nurses, because that would be another option that our candidate pool could look at. All right, if we were hiring academic nursing faculty, we'd have to consider what hospitals were paying nurse practitioners, because that would be another potential market that they could go to. And if we were hiring medical faculty, we'd have to consider what doctors were being paid. So essentially, our product market here would be the other universities who are hiring for similar positions as us, and our labor market would include all these positions in hospitals where people could look for alternative employment. Now, when you're deciding what to pay, you're going to consider the elements of the competitive environment that we just talked about in terms of our product markets and our labor markets. And you have to think about that paying market rate versus paying above the market rate is going to influence whether or not we're able to acquire top talent. So if we're paying above the market rate, we're going to be much more successful in terms of trying to get top candidates to work for our organizations. And our pay policies, although they may not be something that we often think about, are one of our most important tools to acquire top talent and encourage the behaviors that we want to see within the organization. So how do we know where we're paying in comparison to the market? Well, this is where benchmarking comes into place. So to benchmark, what we're going to do is we're going to gather data on what other organizations are paying for similar positions, and we're going to compare our pay policies to those of other organizations. And we can get data from different types of pay surveys. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has a national compensation survey that has a lot of great data on compensation for different positions. The Society for Human Resource Management, or SHRM, has compensation data available to members, and consulting groups such as McKinsey & Company also collect compensation data. Employees often compare their pay to what others around them are paid and judge the equity or fairness in the situation. When an employee is comparing their pay to someone outside of the organization, that's considered an external equity comparison. When they're comparing their pay to someone within the organization, that's an internal equity comparison. When employees believe that their ratio of inputs to outputs is similar to others, they perceive the situation as equitable. But when they believe they're receiving less than others for similar work, they believe there's a lack of equity. For example, if new employees think that they're working harder for less money than other employees, they're going to believe that there's a lack of equity or that the situation is unfair. For a detailed discussion on equity theory, see my video, Introduction to Equity Theory. When employees think that they're under-rewarded, there are a few different ways that they can respond to that. So one is that they may try to reduce the denominator in the equation by putting forth less effort and reducing their inputs. Okay, so essentially if they feel like they're not being compensated enough for the work they're doing, they're going to do less work. All right. They may also look to find different ways to increase their outcomes, and these may not be ethical ways, such as stealing. Okay. They also could look to withdraw by leaving or refusing to cooperate. So they may become problematic in terms of meetings. They may become disruptive. They may refuse to follow certain directions. Okay, and that would be another way of kind of reducing their inputs. And if we're successful as managers, though, one thing that we may be able to get them to do is we may be able to get them to change their reference point. Okay, so if an average employee is comparing themselves to one of your top employees, maybe you can point them towards a reference point of another average employee, somebody who performs at a similar level to them, so that they don't perceive the same level of inequity that they did previously. So in a perfect world, we would be able to set a pay policy that would make all employees always feel that there's equity. But the reality is that that's very difficult to do, because as soon as we adjust one person's pay, another person is going to perceive a lack of equity. Okay, so communicating fairness becomes very important for us as managers. Our employees do care about what their pay looks like relative to others. And we have to remember that these feelings are based upon what they perceive. And what I mean by this is I may work really hard at my job. I may work as hard as another professor who teaches accounting. And that professor who teaches accounting may be paid more than me. So I may look at it and say, wow, we work the same, but they're paid more than I am, and that's not fair. Well, that's my perception. If we go back to our earlier discussion about labor markets, the labor market for an HR professor is very different from the labor market for an accounting professor. An accounting professor could leave academia and go make a lot more money in the field than an HR professor could. Okay, so someone really would need to communicate this to me and help me understand that my reference point shouldn't be an accounting professor, it should be another HR professor. All right, so communicating these types of things and helping employees manage their perceptions is very critical in terms of equity and perceptions of equity within the organization. All right, our employees are going to be able to gather data. A lot of data is publicly available through many of the reference points that we talked about before. And if you're at a state institution or a federal institution, salaries are going to be publicly posted. So we have to recognize that the numbers are out there. All right, how we communicate and how we provide transparency in pay policies is going to help influence how our employees perceive equity within the organization. Now, earlier when we talked about comparative worth policies, I mentioned job evaluations. All right, and these are where we're going to measure the internal worth of an organization's jobs. We're going to identify different factors that we would compensate for. So examples of these factors might be experience, education, complexity, working conditions, responsibility, and then we're going to rate each job on these factors. So we're going to rate, is experience important, is education important, is complexity important, and so on and so forth. And we're going to assign points to each category. We're going to tally up the points to help identify what the value or perceived value of the job actually is. Now, once we've identified the job evaluation points, as we discussed on the last slide, we're going to plot them on a graph. You see them down here on the bottom. Okay, and then we're also going to have our salaries over here on the other axis. Okay, and we should be able to plot positions for each job so that we can go over to the job evaluation points and then up to the salary and plot our circles. Okay, and then we plot all these points here, and in theory there should be a linear relationship between job evaluation points and salaries. And when we draw that line that results from that relationship, that's our pay policy line. Okay, it shows that relationship between the points and the pay rates. All right, now in theory, that's how this is going to work out. It's not always going to work out that way. And if it doesn't work out that way, then we have to look at a few different things. Did we evaluate our jobs correctly? And are we compensating our jobs correctly? And compensation for a position isn't always absolute. Often we're going to have pay ranges, and this is kind of the range of dollars that we're willing to pay for a specific position. So we'll have a minimum point, and we'll have a maximum point, and then we'll have the midpoint in our range. And what doing this does is it allows us to have flexibility in hiring and flexibility in compensating people. Because we don't want to find ourselves in a position where we have the opportunity to recruit a top talent, but we can't because we have a very rigid pay structure that doesn't allow us to pay this person what we need to pay them in order to recruit them. Now, often we have different pay ranges for different positions, and as you see on the example over here, as we look at these pay ranges, they may overlap a little bit. Now, when pay ranges overlap, that can be a little bit problematic. I had one point in my career where I was promoted, and when I was in one position, I was basically over here all the way near the maximum of the pay range, and then when I got promoted, they just basically bumped me over just a little bit. It was like a $3,000 or a $5,000 increase. It was something that wasn't really too high, and it may have made sense based upon the fact that I now had less experience in the position that I was moving into, but as an employee I felt like I wasn't compensated properly for the move that I made where I took on additional responsibilities. So when we think about our pay ranges and how they overlap, we also have to think about what transitions are going to look like when people move from one position into another. And together, our job evaluations and our pay ranges are used to form what we call pay grades. And if you look at the graph here, what you see for the pay grades is that we have jobs grouped together based upon the job evaluation points, and then for each one of these groups of jobs, we have different pay ranges. Okay? Now, this can be very helpful for us in terms of having transparent pay policies that our employees understand, but one thing that can be a little bit challenging is when dissimilar jobs are grouped together, and maybe when the needs of the organization shift as well. Are we making sure that we move jobs from one pay grade into another as they become more or less valuable to the organization? In addition to determining how much to pay an employee, we also have to determine how to pay them. Okay, three common ways of paying our employees are hourly wages, piecework rates, and salary. Hourly wages are common for non-exempt employees. And with an hourly wage, we simply pay someone a specific amount of money for each hour that they work. So if you were paid $15 an hour and you worked 40 hours in a week, your paycheck for that week would be $600 minus taxes and other deductions. Okay? Piecework rate works best in warehouses and factories and places where you're specifically responsible for producing things on your own. Okay, so if you were in a warehouse, maybe you got paid a quarter for each piece that you picked and put on a pallet and shipped out. And if you picked, say, 1,000 pieces in a week at a quarter per piece, you'd be paid $250. Okay, and then finally we have salary, and salary is really reserved for our exempt employees, okay, our people who aren't eligible for overtime pay. And with salary, we pay someone a specific amount per week, month, or year. So you may make $40,000 per year, and that would be your salary, and that's probably divided up over 26 payments per year, but the salary is determined as $40,000. And sometimes we'll choose to offer a pay differential for people to work less desirable shifts or in different geographic locations and so on. So for example, if you were a nurse and they wanted you to work overnights, you might make an extra $3 or $4 an hour to work overnight. Okay, in a warehouse you might make more money. It might not be quite as much. I think my differential when I was managing warehouse employees was something more like $2 an hour. You may pay someone a differential for living in a more expensive area. So if someone was based out of Oklahoma and you wanted them to move to a San Francisco office, you may have to provide some type of differential to cover the cost difference between Oklahoma and San Francisco. We're going to wrap up this lesson here talking about a compa ratio. And a compa ratio is the ratio of the average pay for a position to the midpoint of that pay range. Okay, so basically what a compa ratio does is it helps us see if what we're doing in practice matches our policies. So for example, when I was managing, I had a pay range that I didn't really agree with for department supervisors in my organization. And I could pay them anywhere between $12 and $15 an hour when I hired them. And $12 an hour was really low for that position. So I hired everybody at 15. It didn't matter. I didn't use my discretion there. I just hired everybody at 15. So if I was to look at the midpoint of that range, would have been $13.50. And if I was to look at what my department supervisors were making, I would have had a very high compa ratio. It would have been well over 1 because I was paying most of my department supervisors well above what the midpoint of that range was. Okay, so that would have indicated that there was a misalignment between our policies and our procedures, because our policies should have yielded an average pay of somewhere around $13.50, but my procedures were yielding an average pay that was closer to 15. If the compa ratio is less than 1, then that basically means our average pay is below the midpoint in that range. If you want to look at this in practice with another example here, you can see we've got an example of a pay grade, and this pay grade here has a midpoint in the range of $21.75 per month. Here are the salaries of the employees in that pay grade. They're $23.06, $20.66, $25.23, and $24.14. The average of those salaries is $23.27.25. When we divide that by the midpoint, that gives us a compa ratio of 1.07, which shows that we are paying on average above the midpoint of the range. So we might be overpaying just a little bit or paying our employees a little more competitively than we had intended. Okay, if you'd like to learn more about compa ratios, you can check out my full video over on my YouTube channel here. And that's it for this lesson. Thanks so much for joining me here. This is Billy Obenauer saying, hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something, and we'll talk to you soon.